The 80s, the golden age of arcade games, and quite a wonderful time for movies as well. Growing up in this era for me meant seeing a movie and then wanting a game, letting a game provide more of the same thing from the movie, allowing me to interact with the world I just experienced. Adapting a movie or TV show into a video game makes sense as a concept. Here you have something that already has characters, settings, music, and more. All a developer has to do is pair those traits with gameplay. While this pairing seems to have produced many bad examples, there are several instances of a synergy between source material and the gameplay paired with it. The Indiana Jones series of films have lots of action, suspense, and plenty of adventure. Makes sense as an adventure game, something that makes you think a bit about what you want to do. The Atari 2600 entry for Raiders of the Lost Ark is indeed a product of its time. The game can be immersive despite the graphics, but it does lean heavily upon puzzle solving that seems rather obtuse. This pairing of an adventure game with Dr. Jones would be revisited just a few years later and produce an absolute gem, more than one even, but there is another series of films from Lucas that perhaps lends itself well to more than just a single genre. Star Wars has blasters, lightsabers, and dogfights in space. Action-packed video games welcome it with open arms. If your quest for Star Wars games started while you were still waiting on Revenge of the Jedi to hit theaters, you had access to lightsabers, snowspeeders, and eventually the Star Wars vector-based arcade game, a game I definitely dropped a few coins into many years ago. Something that let me feel like I was flying an X-Wing. As time moved forward, technology evolved and we received games that offered a bit more. For a PC, the adventure game could be cited as a popular genre in the 80s. It certainly has a strong following of retro gamers these days. However, I feel that the flight simulator genre is arguably the more prevalent choice for classic PC gaming, which also has a dedicated fanbase today. In terms of space combat, 1990's Wing Commander brought about its own universe of different alien races, spaceships, and more. I have fond memories of the series. However, I would be lying if I didn't say that Wing Commander had many people pondering something like it, but with Star Wars. Well, I guess we weren't the only ones with Star Wars on the brain. Enter X-Wing. I enjoyed the action provided by the Star Wars arcade game. Blasting TIE fighters, doing a trench run, definitely fun. However, it was naturally arcadey. The scenario changed quickly and it repeated. The redundancy didn't stop me from wanting to play it, of course, but I wanted something more a decade after its release. X-Wing brought the Star Wars spacecraft experience into the modern era, the early 90s that is, and brought with it the need to maintain your fighter by cycling your shield energy during or after a fight and donating power from weapons to shields or shields to weapons as needed. More than anything, though, was the freedom that X-Wing provided. Rather than having a ship on rails where you simply fire at a few targets that are thrown your way, you had control over where you wanted to go. If you want to hang out around a frigate while you plan your attack, you do it. It is a space simulator that involves multiple missions with objectives, events that occur over a period of time. Skirmishes, defensive strategy, ordering your wingman to perform tasks, and having patience for and awareness of your surroundings. All of this is combined into an experience inside the Star Wars universe. As with any simulator, the controls may seem overwhelming at first, but it doesn't take long before they become second nature. And at the end of the day, you're still blasting TIE fighters. It might be difficult to believe these days, but Star Wars was not quite as ubiquitous in 1993 as it is now. At that point in time, it was still possible for a new Star Wars product to feel fresh or even out of the blue.
Welcome to the flagship Independent.
For me personally, getting to experience the smallest things in X-Wing made it so much fun, and it started outside of the craft. Checking out the various areas on the flagship Independence, a fancy menu system really. Seeing familiar characters. Watching cutscenes that added to the experience, such as shuttling to the appropriate launch point, or prepping for launch and watching an astromech droid be loaded into your craft. And of course, a marshaller with glow sticks. The Star Wars-ness is strong with this one. Hopping into an X-Wing, A-Wing, Y-Wing, and in a later expansion, B-Wing fighter was surreal. 320x200 with 256 colors and a decade after Return of the Jedi, this felt as good as it gets. Oh, and if that wasn't enough Star Wars, let's not forget that X-Wing was released in an era where printed media was still a big deal to include alongside your computer game. The Farlander Papers is a 96-page book that includes the following: a story to read, history, such as the rise of the Emperor, the death of the Old Republic, and the origin of the Alliance, a leaflet titled A Call to Reason, which urges its reader to join the rebellion and provides information about people, planets, races, and asks you to kindly not abuse droids. Information about the Alliance fleet, how to qualify as a starfighter pilot, and technical information for spacecraft used by both the Imperial forces and the Rebels. The credits page even cites sources used for reference and, perhaps expectedly, includes references to books from West End Games. The gameplay was there. The Star Wars aspect could have simply been a small bit of window dressing on a pre-existing flight simulator, and technically it was, as X-Wing appears to have been built around a World War II flight simulator that was released by then Lucasfilm Games a year prior. But X-Wing delivered more than just that. It was, without a doubt, Star Wars. The music of Star Wars is quite memorable. It makes sense that it would be present in X-Wing in a synthesized form, as was typical at the time for PCs. One of the most underappreciated traits of LucasArts games was the use of their iMuse system. It allowed the music for player actions to be dynamic, to do things like transition from being in the middle of a tune to ending it in a smooth fashion, or adding instruments to the score as the player moved about the screen in an adventure game. Monkey Island 2 was the first game to use the system and is certainly a prime example of it at work. I definitely noticed it at the time. For X-Wing, the music, transitions, and cues during combat are naturally stitched together at a faster pace than an adventure game. They feel like a MIDI-based film score behind your missions rather than a simple loop of pre-recorded music. A pensive mood while you wait to engage the Empire suddenly transitions into a familiar battle theme. A short fanfare plays after defeating the enemy, followed by pickup notes that return you to the same battle theme. A cue that signals that some allies have arrived. Even simple things like mousing over the historical missions on the flagship Independence adds trumpets to the score. While selecting a tour of duty brings in the Imperial March. iMuse was used across several LucasArts games, and I am certainly glad it was flexed in X-Wing as well, as it really added to the immersion. Having a space combat simulator in the Star Wars universe was a welcome gift that seemed to hit at the right time in terms of what technology had to offer. And X-Wing wasn't something that felt like pouring even more syrup on a previously oversaturated pancake. It was a welcome addition to a franchise that, until about a year before the game's release, had been somewhat dormant, if you can believe it. Star Wars was making a comeback. More games were arriving, more stories were arriving. A sequel called TIE Fighter was released that added polish to the graphics, combat, campaigns, and storytelling, including the addition of a noteworthy newcomer to the Star Wars expanded universe. With the remainder of the 90s also came the release of additional games to the franchise in X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter and X-Wing Alliance, as well as a few updates to the earlier titles by way of collector's editions with improved graphics and other enhancements, including the return of some familiar voices.
Blue Squadron reports the escorting Imperial Corvette wishes to defect.
As the decade came to a close, so did the door on the X-Wing series. This hasn't stopped some fans from wanting to bring it back in modern form, however. The X-Wing Virtual Machine, or XWVM project, aims to produce a mod that allows those that own X-Wing in some form to play through the game with a much more modern feel. X-Wing might be a bit rough around the edges in terms of gameplay, very much so when compared to its next iteration, TIE Fighter. But it opened the door to space combat in the Star Wars universe that stretched beyond simply holding down a fire button while attempting to aim. And I am grateful for that. Thanks for watching.